Number 1. Majestic Howard. In 2014, Majestic Howard survived a violent high-speed crash in a truck he stole. Then, just 15 months later, he was shot in the head by an angry truck owner after breaking into his vehicle. Somehow, he survived that too. For anyone with common sense, that should have been a sign to stop. But common sense clearly wasn't Howard's strong suit. Just 46 days after getting shot, the Albuquerque Police Department decided to put him to the test and see if he'd finally learned his lesson. As they were about to find out, he hadn't learned a damn thing. Howard's car theft rampage started back in 2014 when he stole a truck in Albuquerque and led police on a high-speed chase through the city. But instead of pulling over, Howard hit the gas even harder. He sped through the streets of Albuquerque with officers right behind him until he eventually lost control and crashed the stolen truck. The crash was violent, but somehow, Howard survived. And if nearly getting himself killed was supposed to teach him a lesson, it clearly didn't. Just over a year later, Howard was right back at it. Early on the morning of September 14th, 2015, he made his way to a La Quinta Inn on San Antonio Drive in Albuquerque, where he set his sights on a truck parked outside. The truck belonged to a hotel guest named Peter Chavez, who was inside his room when he suddenly heard the vehicle's alarm going off. Chavez immediately went outside to see what was happening, and there was Howard breaking into his truck. But Chavez wasn't about to sit around and wait for police. He grabbed a handgun, headed outside, and confronted Howard himself. What happened next nearly cost Howard his life. During the confrontation, Chavez opened fire, shooting Howard in the head. Somehow, Howard was still able to get away, but he didn't make it far. Responding officers found him nearby with a gunshot wound to the head and rushed him to the hospital in critical condition. When police questioned Chavez about the shooting, he claimed the gun wasn't even his. According to him, the handgun somehow fell out of the truck during the confrontation, so he picked it up and used it to shoot Howard. But detectives weren't buying it. After speaking with two of Chavez's friends and looking into what happened, they discovered that Chavez already had the gun inside his hotel room and had brought it downstairs with him when he went to confront Howard. That decision ended up getting Chavez in serious trouble as well. Police arrested him and charged him with aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, being a felon in possession of a firearm, and tampering with evidence. But Howard had much bigger problems to worry about. The gunshot wound to his head was so severe that doctors had to surgically remove part of his skull. By all accounts, Howard was lucky to even be alive. And once again, surviving something that easily could have killed him apparently wasn't enough to convince him to stay away from other people's vehicles. Exactly 46 days later, in the early hours of October 30th, 2015, Howard came across another vehicle near Indian School Boulevard and University Avenue in northeast Albuquerque. From the outside, there was nothing particularly unusual about it. What Howard didn't know was that this time, he wasn't stealing from an ordinary resident. The vehicle belonged to the city of Albuquerque, and it wasn't just any car. It was a police bait car, specifically placed there to catch car thieves just like him. Howard got inside and wasted no time getting to work. Using a screwdriver, he managed to start the vehicle and drove away. What he didn't realize was that Albuquerque police were watching the car and could track exactly where it went. At 1:14 that morning, police dispatch reported that the bait vehicle had been stolen, and officers began moving in. Howard kept driving, completely unaware that officers didn't even need to catch up with him to end the chase. Once the bait car reached Hazeldine Avenue in southwest Albuquerque, dispatch remotely shut it down. Just like that, the car came to a stop, and Howard's latest getaway was over before he even realized what was happening. With the car completely disabled and officers closing in, Howard had nowhere left to go. He climbed out of the vehicle, and for a brief moment, actually seemed ready to surrender. He raised his hands as officers approached, but apparently, Howard had one more bad decision left to make. Without warning, he took off running. Several officers immediately took off after him. As Howard ran, they noticed him put something into his mouth, but whatever he was trying to do, he wasn't going to have much time. Officer Jonathan Franco was quickly gaining on him, and within moments, Howard realized there was no way he was outrunning the officers behind him. Realizing he wasn't getting away, Howard finally stopped and dropped into a sitting or kneeling position. But less than 2 seconds later, Officer Franco caught up with him and struck him in the face, knocking Howard to the ground. The other officers arrived moments later and took him into custody. But that single blow would eventually create an entirely new problem for the Albuquerque Police Department, because years later, Howard would take them to federal court over what happened during his arrest. The problem was, Howard was still recovering from being shot in the head just a month and a half earlier. Doctors had surgically removed part of his skull, which meant another hard blow to the head could be especially dangerous. Howard eventually sued the city of Albuquerque and several officers, arguing that the force used during his arrest was excessive. Years later, Howard's lawsuit finally made its way before a federal judge, and surprisingly, the judge agreed with him. Franco's decision to strike Howard violated his Fourth Amendment rights. But that didn't mean Howard won the case. The judge ultimately ruled that Franco was protected by qualified immunity, meaning he couldn't be held personally responsible for the blow. But regardless of what happened during the arrest, one thing remained undeniable. Howard only ended up in that situation because he climbed into a police-bait car, started it with a screwdriver, and drove away. And what made it even more ridiculous was that he did all of this just 46 days after being shot in the head while breaking into another man's truck. Howard was taken into custody, but the case wouldn't end with a conviction. In 2017, he was found incompetent to stand trial, and several of the criminal cases against him, including the one involving the bait car, were eventually dropped. But that didn't keep Howard out of trouble for long. Years later, he was back in court on another criminal case, where he eventually received probation. And by 2025, Howard was in trouble yet again, this time accused of violating the terms of that probation. Number 2, Michael Tolbert. 19-year-old Michael Tolbert probably thought he was getting away with driving around Detroit in a stolen Mercedes. What he didn't know was that the woman who owned it was actively hunting it down. For 2 straight days, Bianca Chambers tracked her car across the city until she finally found it parked outside a barbershop, while Tolbert was inside getting his dreadlocks done. Unfortunately for him, Chambers wasn't about to let him slip away again. And by the time she was done with him, getting arrested would be the least embarrassing part of his day. Tolbert's trouble with stolen cars started long before that embarrassing day at the barbershop. Back in December 2019, when he was just 17, he and another teenager went around breaking into vehicles outside a Meijer store in Northville Township, stealing anything valuable they could find. But when police showed up, the two needed a quick way out, and apparently, they were willing to do just about anything to get one. The teenager with Tolbert was 17-year-old Vante Pitts, and together, they managed to steal around $1,700 worth of property, including a laptop and cell phone. But just as they were preparing to leave, police showed up. Instead of surrendering, Tolbert and Pitts spotted an unlocked vehicle nearby, with the keys still inside, and saw their chance to escape. They jumped in, stole the car, and took off. And for a moment, their desperate getaway actually worked, as they managed to disappear before officers could catch them. Unfortunately for them, they weren't nearly as difficult to find as they thought. After the two escaped, Northville Township Police sent their information to loss prevention teams at other Meijer stores in the area. And not long afterward, Tolbert and Pitts made the mistake of walking into another Meijer in Livonia. Employees recognized them and called police. This time, the two teenagers weren't going anywhere. Both teenagers were arrested, and the stolen car was recovered and returned to its owner. Tolbert was charged with motor vehicle theft, receiving and concealing stolen property, larceny from an automobile, and breaking and entering a vehicle. At just 17, he'd already managed to get himself arrested after stealing a car just to escape another crime. Getting caught that young should have been enough to convince Tolbert that stealing cars wasn't exactly his calling, but apparently, he didn't get the message. Less than 2 years later, in July 2021, Tolbert's name would once again become connected to a stolen car. This time, it was a Mercedes-Benz belonging to Detroit business owner Bianca Chambers. But Chambers wasn't the type to sit around and hope police eventually found her car. She decided she was going to track it down herself. And for the next 2 days, that's exactly what she did. Chambers turned to social media, where people across Detroit began sending her tips whenever they spotted the Mercedes. Each time she got a location, she went after it and called police. Officers responded to 4 separate calls from Chambers during the search, but every single time they arrived, the Mercedes was already gone. Whoever had the Mercedes was becoming more comfortable by the hour. At one point, Chambers' own car was spotted at the same strip mall where she owned a boutique. According to Chambers, they were driving around in it, smoking, and enjoying themselves like the Mercedes actually belonged to them. They even had the nerve to get the stolen car detailed. But on Wednesday, July 14th, Chambers finally caught the break she'd been waiting for. A tip led her to a barbershop near Greenfield and Grand River, where she found her Mercedes outside, and this time, she wasn't letting it disappear again. Chambers stayed nearby and watched the car, and inside the barbershop was 19-year-old Michael Tolbert, casually getting his dreadlocks done. She walked straight into the barbershop, approached Tolbert, and asked him a simple question. Was the Mercedes parked outside his? Tolbert said no. That was probably the worst answer he could have given her. Chambers didn't bother arguing with him. She grabbed Tolbert by his dreadlocks and dragged him straight out of the barbershop. And somehow, dragging Tolbert outside still wasn't enough. Chambers was worried he might break free, jump back into the Mercedes, and drive away before police arrived. So she walked over to her own car and slashed its tires. She was literally willing to damage her own Mercedes just to make sure nobody was driving off with it again. Meanwhile, several people from the barbershop stepped in and helped hold Tolbert down until police arrived. When officers finally arrived, Tolbert was taken into custody. Prosecutors charged Tolbert with receiving and concealing stolen property valued at $20,000 or more. And despite being dragged out of the barbershop by his dreadlocks, Tolbert decided not to pursue an assault complaint against Chambers. But getting a personal bond on the new charge didn't mean Tolbert was going home. He was already on probation from a separate 2020 case, and this latest arrest landed him in even more trouble for violating it. So while Chambers finally walked away with her Mercedes back, Tolbert remained in custody, bringing yet another run-in with a stolen car to a very embarrassing end. Number 3. Antonio Reyes Bermudez. On December 18, 2018, 58-year-old Jose Antonio Reyes Bermudez walked into a car wash in Miami Beach and tried to steal a Mercedes-Benz, but his first attempt failed almost immediately. The owner was still outside, and before Bermudez could get away with the Mercedes, he caught him and took his car back. At that point, Bermudez had every reason to cut his losses and leave. Instead, he stayed around the car wash and waited for another opportunity. Before long, another Mercedes caught his attention, and Bermudez decided to try the exact same trick again. Only this time, he wouldn't live long enough to enjoy what he stole. The second Mercedes was brought to the car wash by Stephen Allen Lott, who worked as a driver and security employee for the car's owner. After handing the SUV over to the employees, Lott headed inside to watch television while they finished the job. With Lott out of sight, Bermudez saw exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for. As one of the employees finished working on the Mercedes, Bermudez casually walked over and pretended the SUV belonged to him, and somehow, it worked. The employee handed him the keys, and Bermudez climbed into the driver's seat, pretending to look around for his receipt as if nothing was wrong. For a moment, his plan seemed to be working perfectly. But not everyone was fooled. The car wash manager, Frank Diaz, quickly realized something wasn't right and walked over to the Mercedes. He ordered Bermudez to get out, but Bermudez refused. Instead, he pushed the employee away, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. At that point, there was no longer any pretending. Bermudez was taking the Mercedes, and anyone standing between him and the exit was about to become a problem. Bermudez hit the gas and sped toward the exit, forcing Diaz to move out of the way. By now, all the commotion outside had caught Lott's attention. He rushed out of the waiting area and immediately saw the Mercedes he was responsible for being driven away. Lott ran toward the SUV, shouting at Bermudez to stop, but Bermudez kept going. And that's when Lott reached for his gun. With the Mercedes still coming toward him, Lott later told police he believed Bermudez was about to run him over. He stepped backward, braced himself for what he thought was about to be an impact, and fired 2 shots toward the driver's side of the SUV. One of the bullets struck Bermudez in the left side of the head. Despite being shot in the head, Bermudez somehow managed to drive the Mercedes out of the car wash and across 18th Street. But he didn't get far. The Mercedes slammed into a parked vehicle before crashing straight into an office depot across the street. The impact damaged electrical equipment inside the building, creating an electrical hazard that made it even more difficult for authorities to reach Bermudez. Police eventually broke through the windows of the wrecked Mercedes and pulled Bermudez out. He was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital, but his injuries were too severe. Bermudez died shortly afterward, bringing his second attempt to steal a Mercedes that morning to a permanent end. And as police began digging into Bermudez's past, they discovered this was far from his first run-in with the law. By the time he walked into that car wash at 58 years old, Bermudez already had 3 previous theft convictions, 2 robbery convictions, and an aggravated assault conviction. He had also served 6 separate prison terms in Florida between 1987 and 2013. Despite all those years going in and out of prison, Bermudez still found himself back in the exact kind of trouble that had followed him for decades. But the case wasn't over, because investigators still had to determine whether Stephen Lott was legally justified in shooting him. And that question wasn't as simple as it might seem. Surveillance cameras captured the entire confrontation, giving investigators a clear look at exactly what happened. The footage showed that Bermudez was unarmed and that the Mercedes had started turning to the right as he tried to escape. Lott maintained that he believed the SUV was coming straight toward him, but investigators found that the bullets entered through the side of the Mercedes rather than through the windshield. But Lott stood by his account. He told investigators that everything happened within a matter of seconds and that, from where he was standing, he truly believed Bermudez was about to run him over. That left prosecutors with one major question. Was there enough evidence to prove Lott wasn't acting in self-defense? It would take them more than 2 years to reach an answer. Finally, in February 2021, the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office reached its decision. Lott would not be charged. After reviewing the surveillance footage, speaking with witnesses, and examining the evidence, prosecutors determined they couldn't prove that Lott hadn't fired because he genuinely feared for his life. They concluded that under Florida law, his actions were legally justified, and no criminal charges were filed against him. And with that, more than 2 years after the shooting, the case was officially closed. Number 4. Dantree Suarez. 17-year-old Dantree Suarez and his friends came across a Dodge Charger being sold online for $5,000 and contacted the owner, pretending they wanted to buy it. They met with him, inspected the car, and arranged to return the following day for a test drive. Everything looked like a normal deal. But when Suarez and his friends came back, they had no intention of handing over $5,000. Their real plan was to pull a gun, steal the Charger, and disappear. What they didn't know was that the sellers had come prepared for trouble too, and before the deal was over, their entire plan would backfire in the worst way imaginable. The man selling the Charger was Fernando Martinez, and although everything about the deal seemed normal, he wasn't taking any chances. His cousin, Ricardo de la Fuente, went with him to meet the buyers, while another relative gave them a handgun for protection in case something went wrong. On the night of August 8th, 2023, the group arrived at Martinez's home in a sedan. There were 4 of them altogether: Suarez, Daquan Ruffin, 15-year-old Anthony Watson, who had posed as the buyer, and a 4th accomplice who wasn't publicly identified. But when it was time to take the Charger for a test drive, only Suarez and Anthony Watson got inside with Martinez and de la Fuente. Ruffin and the 4th member of the group stayed behind in the sedan. Anthony Watson got behind the wheel, with Martinez riding beside him, while Suarez and de la Fuente climbed into the back. With everyone inside, they pulled away for what Martinez and his cousin still believed was nothing more than a normal test drive. And for a while, everything appeared completely normal. But once the test drive was over and it was time to hand over the $5,000, the deal suddenly took a very different turn. Instead of reaching for the money, Anthony Watson pulled out a handgun. Martinez immediately grabbed the weapon, and the two began fighting for control of it inside the Charger. During the struggle, shots were fired, hitting Martinez in the arm and back. But there was one thing Suarez and his friends hadn't counted on. Martinez and de la Fuente were armed too. De la Fuente quickly pulled the handgun they had brought for protection and opened fire, shooting Suarez. Within seconds, their carefully planned robbery completely fell apart. Martinez was wounded, Suarez was shot, and what was supposed to be an easy car theft turned into a deadly shootout, and it still wasn't over. As the wounded Martinez tried to get out of the Charger, Ruffin approached him from the sedan, pointed a gun at him, and took his wallet. His cousin wouldn't be as fortunate. After De La Fuente shot Suarez in self-defense, Watson turned his gun on him and opened fire. De La Fuente was fatally wounded and died at the scene. With De La Fuente dead and Suarez badly wounded, the rest of the group fled, taking the Dodge Charger they came to steal, along with the sedan they arrived in. But with Suarez bleeding from a gunshot wound, they weren't going to get very far without medical help. About 30 minutes later, Ruffin showed up at Northeast Baptist Hospital, carrying the badly wounded 17-year-old inside. Doctors tried to save him, but Suarez died from his injuries. With 2 people dead and Martinez seriously wounded, detectives immediately began working to identify everyone involved in the robbery, and it didn't take long before the group started leaving clues behind. 4 days after the shooting, investigators found Martinez's stolen Charger near Golden Avenue and Somerset Road. Someone had switched the license plates in an attempt to disguise the car, but police quickly confirmed it was the same Charger taken during the robbery. Detectives then traced the Instagram account used to arrange the fake purchase back to the apartment complex where Martinez first met Watson. When investigators searched one of the apartments, they found 2 guns hidden inside a dryer. One of them was immediately recognizable. It was the same handgun Martinez's relative had given him and De La Fuente for protection before the deal. Investigators eventually identified Ruffin as one of the men involved, and when they questioned him, he revealed a detail that made the entire robbery even more senseless. According to Ruffin, he knew the group planned to steal the Charger, but before they went through with it, he warned Suarez and Watson that the robbery was too risky. Instead of listening to him, they mocked him for being scared and went ahead with the plan anyway. As it turned out, Ruffin's warning was exactly right. Ruffin was eventually arrested, while investigators continued building their case against Watson. In May 2024, authorities finally tracked him down and took him into custody. Although Watson was only 15 when the robbery happened, he would eventually be prosecuted as an adult. And while he and his friends had tried to avoid paying $5,000 for the Charger, the price Watson eventually paid was far greater. In December 2025, now 18 years old, Watson accepted a plea deal for the murder of Ricardo de la Fuente. A judge sentenced him to 45 years in prison. Ruffin's punishment followed less than 2 months later. In February 2026, prosecutors dropped the murder charge against him after he agreed to cooperate in the case against Watson. Ruffin was instead convicted of aggravated robbery and sentenced to 20 years in prison. In the end, what was supposed to be an easy way to steal a $5,000 Dodge Charger destroyed lives on both sides. Number 5. Darnell Cotton. In March 2024, 17-year-old Darnell Cotton drove away from a Harris County apartment complex in a car he'd just stolen. He probably expected the owner to wake up later, realize his car was gone, and call police. Unfortunately for Cotton, Dushan Caples was already awake, and he heard his car being taken. Caples immediately grabbed his handgun, jumped into his wife's SUV, and went after his car himself. Before long, he caught up with Cotton and tried to get him to stop. But Cotton kept driving, unaware that Caples was about to take matters into his own hands, and before the night was over, Cotton would pay the ultimate price. The incident happened in the early hours of March 9th at an apartment complex in northeast Harris County, Texas. Caples lived there with his wife, and his black sedan was parked outside their home that night. Everything was quiet until Caples suddenly heard activity outside and realized someone was making off with his car. Cotton wasn't alone in the stolen sedan. An unidentified accomplice was riding beside him as Caples chased them through the surrounding streets. And when it became clear Cotton wasn't going to stop, Caples took things a step further. Caples pulled out the handgun he'd brought with him and opened fire on his own car. Multiple shots were fired into the sedan as Cotton continued driving, and at least some of those rounds struck the 17-year-old. But even after being shot, Cotton didn't immediately stop. He continued driving until he eventually lost control of the sedan on Golden Eagle Drive and slammed into a parked vehicle. The crash finally brought the chase to an end, but by then, Cotton was already badly wounded. His passenger apparently wasn't sticking around to find out what happened next. Moments after the crash, Cotton's accomplice jumped out of the wrecked sedan and took off running with a backpack. By the time deputies arrived shortly before 4 o'clock that morning, he had already disappeared into the surrounding area. Cotton, however, wasn't going anywhere. When deputies approached the wrecked sedan, they found Cotton slumped behind the wheel with multiple gunshot wounds. The 17-year-old was pronounced dead at the scene, bringing his short-lived escape in the stolen car to a permanent end. But at that point, deputies still had no idea how Cotton ended up there or who shot him. When officers arrived at the crash, investigators initially believed Cotton might have been shot during some kind of road rage incident. Then they discovered that the wrecked sedan had recently been reported stolen from a nearby apartment complex. Capel's wife already called 911 to report the theft, and as investigators began piecing everything together, the story led them back to her husband. When detectives questioned Capels, he admitted that he was the one who fired the shots. He explained that he went after his stolen car and opened fire when Cotton refused to stop. But even though Cotton was driving his stolen vehicle, Capel's decision to shoot him brought serious consequences of its own. Investigators arrested the 30-year-old and charged him with murder. Authorities also said there were other circumstances that complicated his case. According to deputies, Capels didn't call 911 to report the shooting, and investigators accused him of destroying evidence afterward. But Capels' attorney argued that what happened wasn't murder at all. He maintained that Capels acted in self-defense, while the case also raised a much larger question about just how far someone in Texas can legally go to protect their property. Texas law allows deadly force to protect property under certain limited circumstances, including considerations such as whether the owner reasonably believes the property cannot be recovered by other means. So even though prosecutors had charged Capels with murder, that didn't necessarily mean he would ever stand trial for Cotton's death. The case was eventually presented to a Harris County grand jury, and in May 2024, Capels received the decision he'd been waiting for. The grand jury declined to indict him. That decision effectively brought the murder case against Capels to an end. He would not stand trial for Cotton's death, although the grand jury did not publicly explain why it chose not to indict him. Number 6. John Styers. At 3 o'clock, one February morning in 2016, Peter Kill woke up to a strange noise outside his home near Hamilton, Ontario. When he looked through the window, he noticed that the dashboard lights inside his pickup truck were on. Someone was inside. That someone was 29-year-old Jonathan Styers. But while Styers continued going through the truck, he had no idea the owner was coming. And by the time he finally realized he wasn't alone, Kill was standing only a few feet away with a loaded shotgun. Styers was a 29-year-old father of 2 from Oswego on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve. Although he wasn't carrying a gun that morning, he did have a folding knife tucked inside his pants pocket. Unfortunately for Styers, the man sleeping inside the house had plenty of experience handling weapons. Kill was 26 years old and had previously served as a reservist with the Canadian Armed Forces, where he received firearms training and learned how to respond to potential threats. He would later say that training immediately kicked in when he realized someone was outside his home. That morning, Kill's then partner, Melinda Benko, was the first to wake up after hearing loud banging outside their bedroom. She immediately woke Kill, who looked through the window and noticed the dashboard lights inside his truck were on. It didn't take long for him to realize someone was messing with his vehicle. But instead of calling 911, Kill decided to handle the situation himself. He went to the bedroom closet and grabbed his pump-action shotgun. He then took 2 shells from a bedside table and loaded the weapon. Wearing only a t-shirt and underwear, Kill made his way toward the back door and stepped outside completely barefoot. Kill quietly moved through a passage between the house and garage before making his way toward the driveway. As he got closer, he could see movement inside the cab of his truck. Rather than announcing himself from a distance, Kill continued approaching as quietly as possible. Styers still hadn't noticed him. When Kill finally came around the back of the pickup, he saw Styers bent over and leaning through the open passenger side door. By then, the 2 men were extremely close. Forensic evidence would later estimate that Kill was somewhere between 3 and 12 feet away. That's when Kill finally revealed himself and ordered Styers to put his hands up. Caught completely by surprise, Styers began rising and turning toward the sound of Kill's voice. And what happened during the next few seconds would become the central question in a legal battle that lasted for years. Kill later said that as Styers turned around, the movement of his hands made it look like he was raising a gun. Given the darkness and how close they were standing, Kill said he genuinely believed Styers was about to shoot him, so he fired. The first shotgun blast struck Styers. Kill immediately racked the weapon and fired again, hitting him a second time. Styers suffered devastating wounds to his chest, shoulder, and upper arm before collapsing beside the truck. But when Kill searched the badly wounded man for the weapon he thought he'd seen, he made a disturbing discovery. There was no gun. The only weapon investigators found on Styers was the folding knife tucked inside his pants pocket. Kill had fired based on what he believed Styers was doing with his hands, not because he had actually seen a firearm. Kill went back inside, where Benko was already speaking with a 911 dispatcher. He explained that he had shot the man outside because he believed Styers was pointing something at him. Kill later returned outside and attempted CPR while they waited for emergency responders, but there was nothing he could do to save him. Jonathan Styers died from the 2 shotgun wounds. When police arrived, Kill didn't deny pulling the trigger. He told an officer that he previously served as a soldier and explained that Styers brought his hands up to what he described as gun height, causing him to react. Kill maintained that he genuinely believed he was seconds away from being shot. But investigators now had a dead, unarmed man beside a truck and a homeowner who admitted shooting him twice. Kill was arrested and eventually charged with second-degree murder. But from the beginning, he maintained that he only pulled the trigger because he believed his life was in danger. His defense was simple. He acted in self-defense. In 2018, Kill went on trial, and the jury acquitted him. But that was nowhere near the end of the case. The Crown appealed the verdict, arguing that the jury hadn't been properly instructed to consider Kill's own actions leading up to the shooting. The issue wasn't simply whether Kill feared for his life when he pulled the trigger, but whether his decision to arm himself and confront Styers in the first place contributed to the deadly situation. Prosecutors argued that Kill had other options. He could have stayed inside, called 911, turned on the lights, or confronted Styers from a safer distance. In 2020, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned Kill's acquittal and ordered a new trial. Kill fought that decision all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. But in October 2021, Canada's highest court sided with prosecutors and ruled that Kill would have to stand trial again. The court found that the original jury wasn't properly instructed to consider Kill's own actions leading up to the confrontation when deciding whether the shooting was reasonable self-defense. That meant Kill had to face another jury. At his second trial in 2022, jurors once again rejected the Crown's attempt to convict him of second-degree murder. But this time, Kill didn't walk away. The jury found him guilty of the lesser offense of manslaughter. In June 2023, Kill was sentenced to 8 years in prison. But the case soon took another unusual turn when the judge admitted that he made a mistake and actually intended to sentence Kill to 6 years, not 8. Kill then appealed both his conviction and sentence. In February 2025, the Ontario Court of Appeal upheld his manslaughter conviction, but reduced his sentence from 8 years to 6 years, concluding that 6 years was the appropriate punishment. With Canada's highest court refusing to hear another appeal, Kill's manslaughter conviction remained intact, and he is now serving a 6-year prison sentence for killing Jonathan Styers. Number 7. Oscar Anoodi Suarez. In the early hours of Valentine's Day, 2024, 23-year-old Oscar Anoodi Suarez and an accomplice were moving through a northwest Miami-Dade neighborhood when they targeted a vehicle parked outside a home. The timing seemed perfect. It was around 2:30 in the morning, the streets were quiet, and they probably expected to finish before the owner even knew they were there. But someone inside the house was already aware of what was happening, and what began as a late-night vehicle break-in was about to end with Suarez making a desperate escape he wouldn't survive. This wasn't Suarez's first recent encounter with the law. Just 2 weeks earlier, on January 30th, he was arrested in Broward County on a loitering or prowling charge. Records also show another arrest in June 2023 involving the alleged fraudulent use of someone else's ID. But whatever lessons those encounters may have offered clearly weren't enough to keep Suarez out of trouble. This time, Suarez and his accomplice had targeted a vehicle parked outside a home near Northwest 79th Avenue and Northwest 194th Street, directly across from Spanish Lake Elementary School. But before the pair could finish what they were doing, the vehicle's owner caught them in the act. Police never revealed exactly what was said during the confrontation, but at some point, an altercation broke out between the owner and the two men. There was also no indication from police that Suarez or his accomplice was armed. The owner, however, was. As the confrontation escalated, he pulled out his handgun and opened fire, hitting Suarez in the stomach. But despite being wounded, Suarez was still on his feet and determined to get away. Suarez and his accomplice rushed back to the vehicle they arrived in, but despite being shot, Suarez got behind the wheel and tried to drive them out of the neighborhood. He didn't make it far. With a gunshot wound to his stomach, Suarez lost control and slammed into several parked vehicles before the car finally came to a stop a short distance away. His accomplice wasn't sticking around to see what happened next. He jumped out of the wrecked car and took off on foot, leaving the badly wounded Suarez behind. By the time police and Miami-Dade Fire Rescue reached Suarez, his injuries were too severe. He was pronounced dead, bringing his attempted escape to an end. With Suarez dead and his accomplice still on the run, investigators turned their attention to the vehicle's owner and began working to determine exactly what happened during the confrontation. And there was one major question they needed to answer. Was the owner legally justified in shooting Suarez? For investigators, the key question was, what happened during the altercation that made the owner open fire? Police hadn't said Suarez or his accomplice was armed, so detectives needed to determine whether the owner believed he was in immediate danger when he pulled the trigger. Miami-Dade Police Detective Andre Martin later warned residents about confronting suspected criminals themselves, explaining that situations like this can quickly become dangerous and that the safest option is to call police. With the investigation still underway, authorities initially said it was too early to determine whether the vehicle owner would face any charges. But as the investigation continued, authorities released very little additional information about the case. The vehicle owner's identity was never made public, and there are no publicly available reports showing that he was arrested or charged in Suarez's death. However, authorities also never publicly announced that the shooting was formally ruled justified, leaving the final outcome of the investigation unclear. Number 8. Brendan Kuza Graham. 25-year-old Brendan Kuza Graham couldn't have asked for an easier opportunity when he came across an unattended Chevrolet Suburban running outside a Spokane home in March 2013. The keys were inside, the engine was already running, and the owner was nowhere in sight. Kuza Graham climbed behind the wheel and started driving away before anyone could stop him. But the SUV wasn't abandoned. Its owner, Gail Gerlach, only stepped away for a moment, and when he returned, he caught Kuza Graham driving off in his vehicle. Gerlach immediately ran after him and yelled for him to stop, but Kuza Graham kept going, completely unaware that his decision to ignore the owner was about to make this the last car he would ever steal. And this wasn't the first time Kuza Graham stole a car. By 2013, the 25-year-old was already a convicted car thief, and even members of his own family later suggested he may have taken Gerlach's Suburban simply to go on another joyride. Gerlach, on the other hand, was a 56-year-old self-employed plumber who lived at the Spokane home with his wife, Sharon. That morning, he started the Suburban and left it running in the driveway while getting ready to take her to work. He only stepped away for a moment, but that was all the time Kuza Graham needed. By the time Gerlach came back outside, Kuza Graham was already backing the Suburban out of the driveway. Gerlach immediately took off after him on foot, shouting repeatedly for him to stop, but Kuza Graham ignored him and continued driving away. As the Suburban continued pulling away, Gerlach saw Kuza Graham turn toward him and raise his arm. Believing Kuza Graham was pointing a gun at him, Gerlach reached for his handgun and reacted. Standing roughly 60 feet away, Gerlach raised his handgun and fired a single shot at the fleeing Suburban. The bullet pierced through the SUV's rear window, continued through the driver's headrest, and struck Kuza Graham near the base of his skull. That one shot was enough. The Suburban continued down the road for a short distance before finally coming to a stop. When Gerlach caught up and approached the vehicle, he found Kuza Graham badly wounded inside. But then he made another troubling discovery. Kuza Graham was unarmed. Police searched the Suburban but found no gun. Gerlach later said what he thought was a weapon may actually have been Kuza Graham holding up the vehicle's keys. But by then, it was too late. Kuza Graham died from the gunshot wound. And although Gerlach just watched his vehicle being stolen, the circumstances of the shooting immediately raised questions for investigators. Kuza Graham was unarmed and driving away when Gerlach fired, so detectives now had to determine whether the shooting was legally justified. From the beginning, Gerlach insisted that he didn't fire simply because Kuza Graham was stealing his SUV. He fired because he genuinely believed Kuza Graham turned around and pointed a gun at him. That claim would become the central issue in the case. After several weeks of investigation, prosecutors charged Gerlach with first-degree manslaughter, meaning he could now face prison for killing the man who stole his vehicle. Gerlach pleaded not guilty and maintained that he acted in self-defense. But before the case went to trial, prosecutors offered him a plea deal. Gerlach could plead guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter, and prosecutors would recommend a sentence of roughly 1 year behind bars. For Gerlach, that wasn't acceptable. He rejected the deal and chose to take his chances at trial. The case finally went to trial in April 2014, where prosecutors focused on the evidence surrounding the shooting. Prosecutors argued that those facts didn't support Gerlach's claim of self-defense, but his attorneys saw it differently. They argued that the case shouldn't be judged by what police discovered afterward, but by what Gerlach genuinely believed was happening in the moment he pulled the trigger. Gerlach took the stand and described seeing Kuza Graham turn toward him and make a movement with his arm that looked like someone pointing a gun. He insisted that he believed his life was in immediate danger and fired only because he thought Kuza Graham was about to shoot him. The defense also presented expert testimony dealing with the bullet trajectory and Gerlach's perception of what was happening. And ultimately, Gerlach's decision to reject the plea deal paid off. On April 10, 2014, the jury found him not guilty of manslaughter. Gerlach walked out of court a free man, but there was still one more unusual chapter to the case. And because the jury found that Gerlach acted in self-defense, Washington law allowed him to recover the legal costs he spent defending himself. His legal team initially requested nearly $330,000 in expenses. After reviewing the claim, the judge approved more than $221,000 to cover Gerlach's attorneys and expert witnesses. So, in the end, Gerlach not only walked away without a conviction, but also recovered a significant portion of the money he spent defending himself. Number 9. Andrew John Herrera. On March 29, 2023, 44-year-old Andrew John Herrera stole a pickup truck from outside a home on the north side of San Antonio, Texas. The owners weren't around to stop him, and within minutes, Herrera was already making his way across San Antonio in their stolen truck. From his perspective, the theft probably couldn't have gone much smoother. But Herrera had no idea that while he drove across San Antonio, the people he stole from knew exactly where he was going. That was because the truck had an Apple AirTag inside it. The small tracking device allowed the owners to follow the vehicle's location, and after realizing their truck was gone, they reported the theft to San Antonio police at around 1 o'clock that afternoon. But they weren't prepared to simply sit around and wait for officers to find it. Using the AirTag, the owners followed the truck's location across the city. The signal eventually led them to a shopping center in the 3200 block of Southeast Military Drive, where they found their stolen pickup with Herrera still inside. Instead of waiting for police to arrive, one of the owners got out and approached Herrera himself. What happened next wasn't entirely clear, but according to police, the owner said Herrera pulled out a gun during the confrontation, and that's when the owner responded with his own weapon. The owner opened fire while Herrera was still sitting inside the stolen truck, striking him in the head. Although he described what happened as a shootout, investigators initially believed the owner was the only person who actually fired. Police were also still trying to determine whether Herrera was armed. By the time emergency responders arrived, Herrera was already dead. The Bexar County medical examiner later confirmed that the 44-year-old died from a gunshot wound to the head and ruled his death a homicide. But Herrera's death didn't automatically mean the truck owner was going to walk away without questions. Investigators now had to determine exactly what happened during the confrontation, and most importantly, whether Herrera was actually armed when the owner opened fire. Police recovered several shell casings from the scene and found 2 vehicles with shattered windows. The truck owner's identity was never publicly released, and investigators initially said it was unclear whether he would face charges. San Antonio police also used the case to warn people against tracking down and confronting car thieves themselves. Officer Nick Solis pointed out that the owners had already reported the truck stolen but reached Herrera before officers arrived, turning the situation into a deadly confrontation. Later reports indicated that the owner wasn't expected to face charges, although authorities never publicly announced a final ruling clearing him on self-defense grounds. Number 10. Kenyon Williams. Just before 5 o'clock on the morning of October 4th, 2025, 18-year-old Kenyon Williams and an accomplice were breaking into cars along Tesson Court in St. Louis. At that hour, they probably expected to get in and out before anyone even realized what was happening. But one resident caught them in the act and came outside to confront them. Instead of running, Williams and his accomplice pulled a gun. What they didn't know was that the resident came prepared too, and within seconds, their early morning crime spree was about to backfire in the worst way possible. Williams was from Overland, Missouri, and had only recently graduated from high school. His family later described him as someone who loved cars and spent much of his time around friends and relatives. But on that Saturday morning, Williams was more than 10 miles from home in South St. Louis, where police say he and his accomplice were breaking into multiple vehicles. Once they were confronted, things escalated almost immediately. According to police, a gun was pulled by the suspects. The resident responded by drawing his own weapon and opening fire. Williams was struck, while his accomplice took off and managed to escape. When officers arrived in the 3800 block of Tesson Court, they found Williams suffering from gunshot wounds. The 18-year-old died at the scene. Police also recovered a gun nearby, while homicide detectives began searching for answers and trying to identify the second person involved. Williams's death was later added to the city's homicide records, but very little about the investigation became public afterward. His family raised money for his funeral expenses and what they described as ongoing legal oversight of the case, while police continued to characterize their account of the shooting as preliminary. And that's essentially where the public record ends. There are no later authoritative reports showing that the resident was arrested or charged, nor is there any public announcement formally clearing him in Williams's death. What police did make clear was how quickly the situation turned against Williams. He and his accomplice were breaking into parked cars before sunrise when they were caught by someone who lived there. A gun was pulled, the resident responded with one of his own, and while Williams's accomplice managed to escape, Williams never made it off Tesson Court alive. In every one of these cases, what started as an attempt to steal someone else's car ended with consequences the thieves never saw coming. If you enjoy videos like these, hit the like button and subscribe for more. And as always, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.